Thank you very much.
So without further ado, let me launch off into some questions. And Professor Chris, in his usual, very organized fashion, has managed to put together some slides in which he will use to respond. And I start with asking Professor Christopher Chen, what is Alzheimer's disease really today? And how do you differentiate it from the dementias?
Okay, thanks so much, Christian. It's such a pleasure to be with you again, virtually rather than physically. Yes, I so much miss coming to India and to Chennai, especially. So allow me to go and share my screen to try and illustrate my answer to your question. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just started. We've not got the slide yet.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay. So, right. Well, Alzheimer's disease, as many of you will know, has a long history. And it started off when Alzheimer did a post-mortem examination on a case of early onset dementia in a lady, curiously enough, also with the initials AD. And he published this as a unique case. He said that this was an unusual cause of early onset dementia because under the microscope, he could see these lesions, which I'm illustrating here now. Amyloid plaques in the middle and neurofibrillary tangles. And he was able to do this because in Germany at that time, there was a huge scientific advance in terms of the kind of chemicals they could use to stain histopathological material. So he named this, well, actually, it was his boss who very kindly, Kraepelin, who very kindly named this disease after Alois Alzheimer's disease. And over time, it's become apparent that Alzheimer's disease is the major cause of dementia in the world. Initially, it was thought to be vascular disease, and now we realize that there's a huge contribution from both vascular disease as well as these Alzheimer's pathologies. We have clinical definitions for Alzheimer's disease. Typically, patients who have a slow, gradual onset of cognitive impairment and loss of function, which defines dementia. But I just want to emphasize that the revolution in conceptualizing Alzheimer's disease now is that Alzheimer's disease is not synonymous with dementia. Alzheimer's disease is now defined by its pathology, and we now realize that this pathology can happen a long time before you develop dementia, and in fact, even a long time before you develop any symptoms. So Alzheimer's disease is now defined as a disease where your brain accumulates amyloid plaques and then neurofibrillary tangles, and then the brain subsequently degenerates. And this is caused by a variety of genetic factors as well as environmental factors. And this is how we differentiate it from other forms of dementia now. And the reason we can do this in vivo rather than just on neuropathology is that we now have biomarkers for Alzheimer's pathology, CSF, PET, and now increasingly blood biomarkers. So we're now confident of being able to diagnose Alzheimer's disease pathology in living people even before they have dementia and even before they have cognitive problems. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I think that it's very clear that this has become an important clinical field where we are able to make diagnosis in a much more accurate way today than we could perhaps 10 years ago. How common is Alzheimer's disease, and what's the scale of the problem in public health terms? Because this also tells us why treatment is important.
I'm so sorry. I have to say I'm not even didn't even bother to move my slides. So so this is just the most recent conceptualization of Alzheimer's disease, and we now define it according to the biomarkers. So patients with Alzheimer's disease are defined by having amyloid, perhaps tau, perhaps neurodegeneration, and you don't have Alzheimer's disease if you don't have amyloid. That's how we're working towards. Now, the other question was, how common is Alzheimer's disease? Scale of the problem. Well, it's huge. Currently, there are over 50 million people worldwide with dementia, and most of them have Alzheimer's disease. And the number will triple in the next 30 years. And the greatest increases, which is the frightening thing, will be in low and middle income countries, particularly in Asia. So you can see that the illustration shows the core that we have now and how large it will grow. The problem is that up to 3/4 of those with dementia worldwide haven't received the diagnosis. Our systems, healthcare systems, are not ready to diagnose and treat patients with dementia. Without treatment, particularly preventative treatment, this burden will increase. Now, here we're talking about dementia. And as I said earlier, Alzheimer's disease is no longer just about dementia. It also relates to people without dementia. So the burden of Alzheimer's disease is even larger than the burden of dementia.
So, Chris, just an ad-libbed clinical question for you. As you point out, the changes that we see in the brain in Alzheimer's disease may actually precede a clinical syndrome developing and people turning up in clinic for us to identify and treat, even those of us who are able to identify and treat, and even those patients who are fortunate to make it. But the question I then have for you is, when does one have a high index of suspicion that this person could develop Alzheimer's disease with or without clinical symptoms?
I think that there is a huge, intense research focus on this. And I believe the short answer will be that we cannot do PET on everybody. We certainly cannot do CSF on everybody. And really, the answer will lie in blood biomarkers. I think that's how we're going to address this huge public health problem. And it's not surprising. I mean, for example, let's talk about something familiar to all of us, ischemic heart disease. When I was a medical student, we had a lot of patients with severe heart failure, and that's how you found out that they had ischemic heart disease, or they presented with heart attacks. But with advances in the treatment of vascular risk factors, we now identify people through blood tests or through simple examinations such as cholesterol, screening for hypertension and diabetes, and we can prevent ischemic heart disease. I think this is how the treatment of dementia is going to advance.
So the message for young doctors and neurologists and psychiatrists in the making and public health doctors in the making is that you're looking at 152 million people with dementia by 2050. And that's a huge public health problem, and therefore treatments are important.
And also importantly, there may be many millions more who have prodromal dementia or preclinical dementia. And our role in public health terms must be to prevent them from becoming demented.
Wonderful. Now, we've heard so many stories about amyloid and tau, and we've actually had two groups fighting each other for years about what is more important. Tell us what happens in the brain and how are these two things linked to each other, if
Thanks,
at all.
Chris. So it's a complicated story. So I've chosen to use this really nice cartoon, which many people have taken to crystallize their ideas about what happens with people with Alzheimer's disease. So if you look at the y-axis as being abnormal pathology or abnormal symptoms, and the x-axis as time, what we now conceive of the natural history of Alzheimer's disease is that, of course, at some stage, we're normal. So no symptoms, no signs, and no pathology. And that the first thing that goes wrong is that there is accumulation of amyloid. Now, of course, this is what we can see. Maybe there's something else that goes wrong first, but we don't have a handle on that yet. What we do have a handle on is that there seems to be early amyloid deposition. And this is silent. People don't have any symptoms. And in fact, it would appear that by the time you have symptoms, the amyloid deposition has already reached a plateau. Subsequent to amyloid deposition, it is thought that other pathologies then start developing. For example, tau. For example, synaptic loss, neuroinflammation, and then eventually atrophy of the brain and cognitive symptoms. So we now think that the brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease has many complex changes, because I haven't also mentioned that most cases of dementia do not have pure Alzheimer's disease. They often have other pathologies such as cerebrovascular disease or Lewy bodies, etc. So I think the most crucial thing to say is that the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease may harbor a lot of pathology before they show any clinical signs, but it is most likely that the earliest pathology, the earliest stage that we can intervene would be in the preclinical or mild stages. And by the time somebody has dementia, the changes may be already too severe to actually reverse.
Thank you, Chris. Until now, what have been the treatments that are available? How do they work? And how is Aducanumab different?
Thanks. So we are all probably familiar with the symptomatic treatments for Alzheimer's disease. This was the revolution which started back in the 70s and 80s, where it was realized that in patients with Alzheimer's disease, there was a severe depletion of the cholinergic innervation. So drugs such as acetylcholinesterase inhibitors were developed. Actually, I have to confess that I'm old enough that Tacrin was discovered and approved just as I was coming into clinical practice. And this has led to a second generation of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which we all use, as well as glutaminergic drugs such as memantine. And we also use symptomatic treatments such as antipsychotic drugs, antidepressants, and the development, there is also constant development of novel symptomatic agents. And, and this is what we use right now. And Aducanumab is different from these agents because it is what we call a disease-modifying agent. That the previous drugs didn't actually attack the root causes of Alzheimer's disease. They just tried to treat. Again, a useful medical analogy would be, say, treatment for asthma. We use corticosteroids and salbutamol, etc., to treat the symptoms. Sorry, we use salbutamol to treat the symptoms of asthma, and we try and modify the underlying disease by using steroids.
Sorry, Chris. I didn't catch the last bit of that.
Oh, sorry. So if you want to think about the difference between disease-modifying and symptomatic treatments, you can think about the example of asthma, where we use salbutamol and other similar drugs to relieve symptoms, but they don't actually treat the disease. And we use corticosteroids to try and modify the underlying inflammatory processes with disease.
Thank you. So that's very clear, therefore, that we actually have today a drug that goes beyond symptoms and is making an influence on the disease process. But
also important to say that a disease-modifying drug may not necessarily have any effect on symptoms per se. It may affect the disease course, but not necessarily improve any symptoms right away. So for example, again in asthma, if you wanted to relieve your wheeze, you would take salbutamol. Just taking steroids by themselves won't help.
That's a very, very helpful and useful analogy.
Yeah.
Now, this drug has had a rather checkered journey, and it has a few cousins who have also been part of that journey. Could you please trace that journey for us and tell us what's the current relevance of this?
Well, thank you very much. And now this is going to be a long, slightly longer explanation, if you don't mind. So the whole issue about amyloid, which if we believe is a central feature of Alzheimer's disease, is that you can get excess amyloid either by overproduction or by failure to clear it. So diseases such as Down syndrome, where you have trisomy and you have increase in APP mutations, all overproduce A beta. But of course, this may be not the case for sporadic Alzheimer's disease, where it may very well be a failure to clear the A beta that's already normally produced. So two ways of addressing the therapeutic challenge, either to inhibit the production of A beta or to promote degradation. So various efforts to inhibit A beta biogenesis have not proven very successful, mainly because they may not have had enough effect on clearing the existing A beta, and also because of side effects because of either on-target or off-target problems. And what we're going to talk about now is ways of promoting degradation and clearance, mainly by using antibodies. And this started off with an amazing experiment, which was done back in the last century, where animals who had a genetic predisposition to develop amyloid, you can see the panels on the left, if you vaccinated them with an active vaccination against amyloid, the plaques disappeared. And this very quickly went into clinical trials and very quickly stopped in clinical trials because the active immunization produced, unfortunately, significant side effects. 6% of the patients exposed to the active immunization developed meningoencephalitis, and some died. Good news, of course, is that, so this is the bad news, that people develop really nasty looking lesions. And you will see these lesions, albeit in a less problematic form when we talk about current anti-amyloid treatment. But the good news is that on post-mortem studies, patients who were given this vaccine appeared to have clearance of the amyloid plaques. So on the left, you can see a typical patient with Alzheimer's disease with these angry-looking lesions, which are plaques. And on the right, you see a patient who died after vaccination, and it would appear that these plaques are disappearing. This led to a whole series of trials using various anti-amyloid strategies, which was a litany of failure. I think the most crushing failure was when Lilly produced several phase 3 trials for an anti-amyloid antibody called solanezumab, which suggested that there may be some evidence that people with less severe Alzheimer's disease had benefit, but when they did a trial on mild dementia, there was absolutely no difference. So again, I used the same slide as I showed before, and lessons were learned from this set of failures. So one lesson was, firstly, perhaps it's not a good idea to treat people at a late stage of the disease. And the second lesson, which of course, seems so apparent now, but was difficult to accomplish before, was that you should only be treating people who actually have amyloid. And the sad truth is that if you make a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, up to 30% of these people that you make a clinical diagnosis on of Alzheimer's disease do not have amyloid. And the percentage of people who do not have significant amyloid goes up if the severity of the dementia lowers. So people with mild cognitive impairment, about 50% of them won't have amyloid. So this is where the research framework comes into action, and it was decided that from henceforth we would only treat people who are amyloid positive. And there has been an explosion in the kind of drugs that are in trials. So you can see on this lovely slide from Jeff Cummings and his colleagues that whilst there are still symptom-reducing small molecules being developed in the pie on the left, the bulk of work is now on disease-modifying treatments, either through antibodies or through small molecules. Krish?
Right. Thank you so much, Chris. I think you've taken us through that journey very, very well. Reading the reports that have appeared in the press, the Aducanumab trials appear to have demonstrated varied results, including a possible dose-dependent response. So is FDA approval for specific doses? And what is your view on this dose-dependent response that's been talked about? And even that appears to have been inconsistent.
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I think let's look at the data, okay? So the first exciting news about Aducanumab actually came out in Nature. Now, many of you will know that Nature is a very prestigious scientific journal, but it's very uncommon for Nature to carry results of clinical trials, especially phase 1 clinical trials. So this was an early clinical trial reported back in 2016, where prodromal or mild AD patients, only about 100 of them, were given Aducanumab. And the reason this got into Nature was because it was a very unique trial. This was the first trial to use amyloid PET as a selection tool. So everybody that got into this trial had positive amyloid PET, and this is shown by the panel on the left. These are 4 different patients who at baseline had PET scans showing, and this is a color-coded scan, so in red shows heavy deposition of amyloid in their brains, typical of Alzheimer's disease. And they were given 3 different doses. So again, these are representative cases, and what you can see is that patients on placebo, nothing happened to their amyloid load. And with increasing doses, you can see for yourself that there seems to be a significant effect on amyloid. And by the time you reach the top dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram, at the end of 1 year, this patient's scan was normal. There was no significant amyloid left. So this shows the dose-dependent nature of the amyloid clearing effect of Aducanumab. And unbelievably, this had never been shown before in such a way by previous anti-amyloid treatments. Moreover, there was some suggestion, even in this small trial, that there was a clinical benefit associated with the highest doses. So on the top 2 panels on the left, you can see that at 6 months, there was no difference in the clinical outcomes between these groups. On the top right panel, you can see a suggestion that the highest dose had a significantly different outcome compared to placebo and maybe the other doses as well. Now, this is not so clear on the MMSE. It's clearer on what we call the CDR sum of boxes, which is, I think, a much more reliable outcome measure for these kind of cases. So Biogen, who produced Aducanumab together with Eisai, then took a very aggressive path. They decided not to do a phase 2 study. Those of you familiar with clinical trials know that after a phase 1 study, you usually go to a phase 2 study to select the optimal dose for progressing into phase 3 trials. But Biogen decided that nope, they were going to do 2 pivotal 18-month randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies using 2 dosing regimes, low and high. And they were going to randomize between these 2 dosing regimes of placebo on a 1-to-1-to-1 basis. You may also know that the trials were suddenly halted to everybody's dismay in March 2019. And we were told at that time that there was a planned futility analysis, and the statistical analysis suggested that there was very little chance that these treatments would have any benefits. The company stopped the trials. And the rest of us were faced with yet another huge disappointment with anti-amyloid treatment. But 6 months later, another announcement came out saying that actually the results were reversed, and that the company concluded that the futility analysis, which was based on a smaller, earlier data set with less exposure to high-dose aducanumab, was just wrong. And that now they had a larger database, because I think I should explain that, because if you do your futility analysis in March, you have to cut your database somewhere in December. So they had these additional data between December and March, and it was enough to show that in one trial at least, there was a positive response in the pre-specified primary and secondary endpoints. And that the company, after analysis, felt that these positive results, this sudden turnaround, was driven by the fact that more patients were analyzable who had greater exposure to high-dose aducanumab and for a longer time. This is one way of showing what happened to the trial, because trials are complicated beasts. So what happened is that, if you remember, there were 2 dose regimes and 2 clinical trials. And initially, there were 2 dose regimes because it was felt that people who were ApoE4 positive had more risk of side effects, so they couldn't go to the higher dose. And after a while, it turned out that this was incorrect. So they did a protocol variation and allowed people to titrate up to 10 milligrams. And even before that, there was another protocol variation to say that if you had abnormalities when you were given this treatment, you didn't just stop completely and restart at a much lower dose. You could restart at the same dose and titrate up to the original assigned dose. So I think one of the problems is that, these are the kind of things which would have been sorted out in a phase 2 trial before you go into phase 3 trial. But they didn't do it, and they nearly lived to regret it, because you can see that the number of people who were recruited at different times were different. And it led to the fact that a lot more people eventually got to higher doses, but it took a lot of time for them to get to these higher doses. So it was really, and people who were enrolled early in the high dose arm actually received a lower dose. If you were to ask me whether this is the right way of doing clinical trials, this would be a really good case study into how to do almost everything wrong. Because with this kind of dosing regime, you actually have not the slightest idea what people doses really are. There will be people who are on 1 milligram, 3 milligrams, 6 milligrams, or 10 milligrams for different periods of time. Suffice to say that the number of people that were analyzable changed dramatically. So the futility analysis you see on the top only about 50% of one trial and about 60% of the other trial could be analyzed. And when they finally got to the larger data set, many more people were analyzable, and so you had much more data to look at. Now, to summarize, what happened is that in one trial, which was positive, the CDR sum of boxes was significantly different in the high dose group compared to the placebo group. There's a 22% reduction in the rate of decline. The absolute difference was 0.39 in a scale which went from 0 to 18. So not a very large difference, but a statistically significant difference. And the same thing you could say for MMSE, ADAS-Cog, and the ADCS, ADL, Activity of Daily Living scale. They all went in the same direction. There was no significant benefit in the low dose group. Moreover, it was possible to show that in a subset of people who had amyloid PET studies, there was a dramatic reduction in amyloid. So the high dose group had a much lower amyloid compared to the low dose group, and definitely compared to the placebo group. And again, this is graphically the description of what happens with your CDR sum of boxes. So this illustrates how patients who are put on aducanumab, they are still declining. It is not a symptomatic treatment. Patients continue to decline, but they simply don't decline as much. So the top line is the rate of decline for people with placebo, and you can see some flattening of the line for patients on high-dose aducanumab. And those of you who are really optimistic might be prepared to say that perhaps it will completely flatten out rather than slowly get worse. There's no data for that, okay? This is just in the eye of the beholder. Unfortunately, the other trial, which also showed a significant decrease in amyloid, did not show a similar effect on clinical endpoints. So you can see here that the high-dose aducanumab group showed a numerically worse outcome. There was no improvement. So it was very disappointing. But a post-hoc analysis on a group of people who achieved the high dose of aducanumab and were treated for a long time showed that in both groups, both trials, there appeared to be a significant improvement. So you can see here on the left panel, this is the intention to treat analysis. This is everybody. So a positive response for the high dose group in one trial, a neutral response in the other trial. But when you only look at this selected post-hoc defined population, there are significant benefits both in the trial 1 as well as trial 2. And this is an illustration of it. So to answer your question, yes, there's a dose response, and yes, the FDA has only licensed the higher dose.
So Chris, I'm going to ask you a couple of ad-libbed clinical questions.
Sure.
The one thing I was wondering, therefore, if I as a practitioner wanted to prescribe this drug, I will need to make a biomarker-based diagnosis. Is that correct?
Well, it would depend on the regulators in your country. So right. In the USA, the FDA has just stated that this drug should be used on patients with Alzheimer's disease. It did not specify that there should be a use of biomarkers. However, I would like to point out in USA, the NIH definition of Alzheimer's disease, the new definitions incorporate the use of biomarkers. So you can say that, if you were in the USA, you couldn't just do a clinical diagnosis. Important to say that the trials only put in people with a biomarker positive diagnosis. Now, if I were a patient, would I go into a trial for amyloid if I didn't have amyloid? I don't think so. And I would be very cautious if I were a doctor in putting people on this trial without biomarker, on this medication without biomarker evidence.
Thank you. That is very clear.
Yeah.
The other question I have as a jobbing doctor is most of my patients are already on an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and memantine for their symptoms. Will they continue if they're going to also take Aducanumab? Do we know anything about that?
Well, Krish, I would imagine that most of your patients who are on acetylcholinesterase inhibitors and memantine would have moderate to severe dementia. Probably.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're licensed for. I think it's important to remember that these trials were performed in patients who were diagnosed. I mean, trial 1 and 2, the big trials, were done in patients who we would call MCI due to Alzheimer's disease, because they had a CDR score of 0.5. Only the very earliest trial, the phase 1 study, also took in people with a CDR score of 1. So I think that it wouldn't be very likely that unless you, because the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors and memantine are not licensed for use in MCI. So your patients would probably not be on MCI. Now, of course, the other issue is, since the FDA has said that anybody with Alzheimer's disease would go on this drug, can we put anybody on it? I think that you would have to have a serious discussion with your patient and your regulators about this. Because I emphasize, these trials were not done in patients with moderate to severe dementia. We have no idea whether it's of any benefit to these patients.
Thank you. That's very clear.
Yes.
So how will this drug be administered, and what are the practical implications of this?
Okay. So I think there are a few disclaimers, all right? Right now, Aducanumab is only approved in the USA. It is not approved in any other jurisdiction. I believe that the company is planning to go and sort of make the necessary regulatory applications. And the regulators in different countries may have different rules. So I think I'm only going to comment on what the FDA approved guidelines are in USA. I cannot be sure if it's going to be the same for every country. Secondly, I should say that I have no personal experience of giving Aducanumab. I did not take part in the clinical trials. However, I have taken part in a series of advisory boards organized by ISI, who's also developing the drug, to discuss possible approval of these disease-modifying drugs and the impact on all of us in Asia. So I'll give you my thoughts based on that. So here's what the FDA-approved drug label says. It says, okay, you can give up to 10 milligrams per kilogram of Aducanumab, Aduhelm. Aduhelm is such an unpleasant name compared to Aducanumab, but never mind. But you have to titrate. The drug is given intravenously, and it takes about an hour, or maybe up to or longer, every 4 weeks, but at least 21 days apart. And the recommended dosing schedule is that you start off low at 1 milligram per kilogram, and then after 2 months, you increase to 3 milligrams, and then again, after another 2 months, you increase to 6 milligrams, and then you go up to the maximum dose of 10 milligrams per kilogram, provided, of course, there are no side effects, etc. And this this drug in America comes in 2 dosage forms. Well, yes, 2 dosage forms and strengths. So you either get a 1.7 mil vial or 3 mil vial. And I suppose how much you use will very much depend on your population. So in America, where everybody is 100 kilograms and above, you probably need to use many vials.
Yeah.
And much less in India. Okay, so what are the problems? Well, The major side effects are what we call amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And these are either edema or hemorrhage. So because of these, you need to have an MRI scan of your patient at least within the past year to make sure that they don't have any of these abnormalities. Because, for example, if they had already had evidence of bleeding, either superficial siderosis, don't worry, I'll show you some pictures later, or microhemorrhages, then you shouldn't start treatment. And during treatment, the advice is to have monitoring, safety monitoring using MRIs. So the rule in America is that you need an MRI prior to the 7th dose, in other words, the first 10 milligram per kilogram dose, and also after the 12th infusion. In other words, after 6 months and after a year. And if, even if in the absence of symptoms, there are severe ARIA that develops, you should really consider whether you should continue with the medication. But of course, people could be symptomatic beforehand. So here's a definition of the different types of ARIA on MRI. So ARIA-E, edema, which can be classified to mild, moderate, and severe, microhemorrhages, and superficial siderosis. Don't worry, by looking at it, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So let me give you some pictures. So here's a patient who developed on another antibody treatment, what we call ARIA-E. So these are flare-positive changes you can see in the cortex, which shows different degrees of inflammation. And there are patients who develop what we call superficial siderosis. You can see here on a different sequence. This is a T2 star sequence, which looks for bleeds. You can see that they have bleeding on the surface of the brain, which deposits iron in the sulci, or they could develop what we call microhemorrhages in the brain. Okay? So going back here, I think that, I'm sorry if this is a very dense slide, but basically what it's telling you is that ARIA is common. Many patients on the highest dose get it, and much more than patients on placebo. But I think the important thing to say is that most of these patients do not have symptoms. And the symptoms are not very severe. They may get headache, or they may get delirium or dizziness. And most of the time, these symptoms go away if you either cut down the dose or maintain the dose. And serious symptoms associated with ARIA is only in 0.3% of patients treated with the high dose. Most symptoms resolve. So this is why people are very scared of ARIA in the first place, and they didn't allow any increases in dose. But now that we have more experience with ARIA, they look more frightening than they actually are. And I think that when you read the press and they say, oh my goodness, there's so many side effects, there's brain swelling and there's bleeding, I think that you need to remember most of these are asymptomatic and don't seem to cause harm.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So these are the rules that you have, okay, under the guidelines. So, obtain brain MRIs, and if you have problems, you should temporarily suspend. You can resume if there's no further problems. And I think that the bottom line is that for your patients taking Aducanumab, you're going to have to do a lot of MRIs. You're going to have to do at least 3 MRI scans and more if they develop ARIA.
So the drug is expensive, and then the cost add is the repeated MRIs as well, apart from needing to go into hospital to have infusions, a bit like chemotherapy.
This drug is really not for everybody. So, and this is a list of all the side effects that were reported that were more than 2%. So you can see that that 35% of people that you treat will have ARIA.
That's a large number.
Absolutely. So, you have to deal with it. But, we'll talk about it later, but Alzheimer's disease is a horrible disease. So we need to think of Alzheimer's disease as being as horrible as cancer. And people with cancer put up with a lot of side effects.
Absolutely. In fact, the way the infusions were described, it reminds me so much of chemotherapy.
Well, absolutely, it is. It's that intensity of treatment. I think this is the big shift that we're going to have to think of. That treating people with dementia is not. I don't know about you, Krish, but when I trained as a neurologist to begin with, it was a gentleman's sport. You came in for a very difficult patient. You took a lot of history, elicited a lot of signs. You made a diagnosis, which was very clever, and then you went away because there was nothing you could do about it. But now we're going to have to be, I think, much more, let's not use the word aggressive, much more engaged with our patients and much more engaged with our treatments.
It's on a positive vein. This gives practitioners of dementia an opportunity to be proactive if they make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in a patient. And this is the first example, perhaps, of proactive treatment.
Yeah, absolutely.
As an Asian expert on Alzheimer's and other dementias, what are your concerns about this new development, conceptually and clinical practice-wise?
So I think we've talked about the conceptual issues. I think that as a dementia specialist, we may have to shift our focus. I mean, I think most of us in our training have focused on how to deal with the many difficult problems faced by people who already have established dementia, to try and keep them in the community, to try and manage behavioral issues, to try and manage the many social issues that they face and the challenges that our caregivers have. So in addition to this, we are now going to have to conceptualize the treatment of people with MCI or even preclinical dementia, and that we are going to have to maybe ramp up the kind of treatments that we use and to be much more intensive. So that's the conceptualization. In terms of clinical practice, there are huge problems. We already have issues with access to dementia diagnosis and management. There are very few dementia clinics. There are very few resources given to dementia clinics. How do we cope with all this huge new demand, especially for mild cases? I think that many clinics around Asia really only take in people with dementia, but we're now going to have to take in people with MCI and who may have preclinical dementia. If we now focus so much on mild cases, are we going to neglect the moderate to severe cases? That would be terrible. If we just focus on AD, what happens to non-AD dementia? Are we going to neglect vascular dementia, diffuse Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia? And with this increasing demand, are any of our healthcare systems really prepared? So I think that we've had discussions with many colleagues across Asia, and although people are very excited with this new era, we're also very worried that we can't cope.
And in a sense, for the patient with dementia, especially in low and middle income countries, things like this probably increase the inequity, don't they? Even more.
Well, sadly, the pricing of the drug is entirely up to the company. So I hope that Biogen will hopefully adapt their pricing for different countries, because as you know, right now, they're going to sell the drug at a cool $56,000 a year. And it's nice of them to say that they're not going to increase this price for at least 4 years. $56,000 is even for Singapore an amazing amount, because that would translate to about 6,000 Singapore dollars a month, which is double the mean salary, the median salary, sorry. So I don't really know how people are going to afford this. And as you said, Krish, it's not just the cost of the drug, it's the cost of the diagnostics, it's the cost of the infusion, and it's the cost of the safety measurement.
Absolutely. I'm going to request everyone to put their questions in the Q&A section so that we are able to address them. There are one or two interesting questions in chat, but I'd be very grateful to have them in the Q&A section. Chris, this is set up as one of our people have pointed out, Vishwanath Vaidyanathan points out, a firestorm of a debate.
Yes.
Why has it become so controversial? Because on the one hand, a number of scientists are very upset. On the other hand, you have patient advocacy organizations that appear to be very excited. Obviously, the FDA has taken a bit of a gamble. And what do you think about all this?
I think in real life, decisions aren't clear-cut. And there are many factors to balance, as we all realize. So let's just go through it quickly. Okay, so the FDA agreed to have what is called a fast-track approval for Biogen. So they said they would give a decision within 9 months or something like that. So the usual way that the FDA makes decisions is that it has an internal clinical reviewer, an internal statistician, and an independent panel. The FDA's own experts were divided. So the clinical reviewer said it looked good. I mean, the data that I just showed you seemed to, they wanted to approve it. The FDA statistician said that when you look at this data, it's so confusing and complex, there is no clear statistical proof that it is effective. And the illustrious FDA panel, which contains a colleague who we can't name, I suppose, because he's conflicted, were very negative. This advisory committee will ask several questions. The first question they asked was, does the single positive trial, which I showed you, provide strong evidence that supports the effectiveness of the drug? And they voted 8-1. They said, no, a single trial does not provide strong evidence. They were also asked to consider the data from this single trial independently and without regard for the other large trial. And they said, no, you can't do that. Whilst there is a suggestion of the effect in one trial, there are enough worries in terms of all these changes to protocol I talked to you about, changes in unblinding, observation of efficacy in the final analysis without the full cohort, etc. They said that this was not acceptable. It didn't add up to strong evidence. Now, there was also a second vote asking whether this small phase 1b study, which I also showed you, provides supportive evidence. And this was 7-0. 4 members said they weren't certain. The third question was whether the company had presented strong evidence of a pharmacodynamic effect on AD pathology. In other words, the effect on amyloid. And it was 5-0 positive. They said, yes, there was an effect on amyloid. But surprisingly, 6 panelists still said they were uncertain. And the final question was, can the single emerge study stand alone as primary evidence of efficacy? And it was again 10-0 with 1 voting uncertain. So this was an unequivocal rejection of the data by the independent committee. And again, all of us thought, okay, that's the end of the story. But to our surprise, the FDA then said, okay, we need 3 more months to reach a decision. And the canny analysts from drug companies said this was a good sign, because other trials which had this kind of delay were the rest of us who are not analysts weren't too sure. But the analysts were right, because as you know, a couple of days ago, the FDA approved Aducanumab. But they then wrote this very interesting letter explaining why they approved it. They said that they approved it under a scheme that I think most of us are not familiar with. Now, this scheme called the Accelerated Approval Pathway has existed since the 90s, but it has been mainly used for oncology drugs. So those of us in the neurological field just, I think, came to me as a surprise. And it also came to the panel, the independent panel, as a surprise, because they weren't asked about this pathway either. So this is a pathway where the FDA approves a drug for a serious or life-threatening illness that may provide meaningful therapeutic benefit because it has shown an effect on a surrogate endpoint. In other words, in this case, amyloid, that is reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. And there's some uncertainty still about the drug's clinical benefit. So the FDA admits there is still uncertainty about the clinical benefit. But the FDA is convinced, as many people are, that there's an effect on this surrogate endpoint. And it's also reasonably sure that this surrogate endpoint will lead to a clinical benefit. So you need to remember that sequence of thought. Okay? And I think there are also other pressures, because there has been no novel therapy approved for Alzheimer's disease for almost 20 years. And I think that people think that if you don't have a success now, this will set back development of therapy for a long time. The FDA admitted that the data included is very complex, and there are residual uncertainties, and there's a lot of public debate, and the expert community offered many different perspectives, but they feel that they have followed what they call their usual course when the data is not straightforward. They examined the clinical trial findings, they solicited input from an advisory committee. Of course, they didn't listen to them. They listened to the patients, and they reviewed all relevant data, and they decided to use this accelerated approval and approve the drug. So the FDA, I think, has been very thoughtful. I think that it has tried its best to balance competing claims from scientists who may be curious and patients who may be not so turned on by the science, and by a wide range of clinical opinion, because not all clinicians and scientists are against approval. So this is, of course, as you've noted, led to a lot of sensational headlines. Nature said that this approval confounds the research community.
Yes.
Other pharma commentators said that this Biogen was really lucky, because otherwise they would have not been able to make profit, and the stocks would drop. Many people commented that it's not a very convincing drug, but it's a really high price tag. And then the New York Times said that it's a bonanza for Biogen at the taxpayers' expense, because there's scant evidence that it works. It will generate billions of dollars, much of it for Medicare, so taxpayers beware. Yeah, there you have it.
So I've got a couple of questions in the chat box. One very interesting question is, how long do you have to take this once it starts?
Well, excellent question, for which we really need better answers. So right now, it's an 18-month trial. And we know that there's a significant drop in amyloid already at 1 year. So if you use the oncology model, why are we still bashing people with the drug when you've already achieved a surrogate endpoint? Would it not be better to give people a tailored regime where you whack the amyloid down to whatever level you want? And of course, we know that amyloid accumulates very, very slowly. So maybe we can give people this, a very intense anti-amyloid treatment for a year, and then change to either no treatment or less treatment or different treatment to keep people in remission. That's again an oncology model. We don't know. So right now, the FDA advises that people should be on this treatment for at least a year. Should they be on it for longer? How much longer? We don't know.
The other question was, will it ever be available as a tablet?
I think that unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. This is a biologic, which our GI system is designed to digest. So I think that moves are being made to change this into a subcutaneous formulation. But again, we need trials to show that it's equally effective.
And there's someone who's asked about a drug, GV971, developed in China, which has been approved by the Chinese regulator and is now available there. What are your thoughts on that?
I have very limited opinions on this because there was a trial which was done in China. We don't know how these patients will. Okay, so let's just suffice to say there's very limited information, and I know that the company wanted to do a global trial so as to get global approval, but COVID-19 has made that very difficult. So right now we're treading water with GV971.
So it's kind of watch the space at this point in time. Really.
Yes, and this affects many other drugs as well, and I think we're going to come to talk about that later.
Right. Chris, if I had a family history of Alzheimer's disease, a strong family history, how does this impact on me in the future also?
Well, Chris, I think it very much depends on what you mean by a strong family history. So if your strong family history is for long-lived parents and grandparents, then you may not have a genetic cause for Alzheimer's disease, but you may just have increased risk of sporadic Alzheimer's disease because you just lived long enough. On the other hand, if you have a family history of early onset Alzheimer's disease, you may well have a genetic cause. Now, whether this treatment works for genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease is not clear. You will know that there is a dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease network, which is trying to do trials precisely on this. And I am not aware of whether they have performed trials using Aducanumab. I think they use other antibodies, which didn't give a very strong effect. And that may be because they didn't give it a high enough dose for long enough, etc. But we don't know for whether the same result would occur in people with dominantly inherited Alzheimer's disease.
There's a question from Professor Jamuna Rajeshwaran. Given the expense of these treatments, how do they compare with non-pharmacological treatments, which are far less expensive?
Would you like to expand on what kind of non-pharmacological treatments?
I think she's alluding to all the research on certain non-pharmacological treatments like exercise, which appear to be gaining, credence as ways of preventing or delaying progress. And they're obviously not as expensive as something like Aducanumab. So how does one sort of balance these two things out?
Thank you very much. Okay, clearly this is a very important public health issue. How do we, what's the most cost-effective way of preventing dementia? I think most of us are aware that the epidemiological evidence suggests that there are many potentially reversible causes of dementia, including physical activity, diabetes, hearing loss, etc. And I think that many of us in the research community are trying our best to see whether the results of the FINGER study, which was a multi-lifestyle intervention trial, really can be replicated and has a similar effect in cultures across the world. Suffice to say that single intervention, lifestyle intervention, doesn't seem to be as effective as multiple lifestyle interventions. And multiple lifestyle interventions are not as inexpensive as you think. So it takes a lot of effort to keep people on the right track. And I'm not necessarily sure that lifestyle interventions are cheap. That's number one. Number two, we don't really have a lot of evidence that what the mechanism necessarily of these lifestyle changes are. To me, most of these lifestyle changes have an effect on cerebrovascular disease and not necessarily amyloid. What we know from finger is that whether or not you have amyloid in the brain, these, or whether you have ApoE4, for example, these lifestyle interventions also still seem to work in reducing rate of cognitive decline. But I don't know whether there's any effect on amyloid. I think it's much more likely they have an effect on cerebrovascular disease.
Right. Thank you. And I suppose these things are complementary in the sense that if you can, if you have access, there is absolutely no harm in doing both rather than only one. It's a matter of access, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. I think that we cannot come away with the idea that there's only one answer, one cause, and one answer to dementia. I think it's multiple factors. And I think that we should use whatever is available to try and prevent dementia. So, for example, if it is impossible to afford a $56,000 US dollar drug for everybody, then we as societies need to decide what we can afford. But the most important thing is to decide and do it.
Thank you. Vivek Mishra asks that in 2019, there were 31 agents in phase 1 and 74 in total pipeline, and Aducanumab was one of them. And many other agents were also monoclonal antibody agents. Yep. Does the current approval improve the probability of many more drugs coming out of the market, which otherwise would have failed?
Well, we hope so. So you were going to ask me about whether this controversy had any links with
the battle of the blockbusters, which we all encountered many, many years ago when TPA came out, yes.
And this is a very apt example. But I also would remind people that there was also a lot of controversy about the approval for Tacrin. If you have long enough memories, you know that Tacrin was a terrible drug. It had awful side effects, hepatic problems, etc. And so when the FDA approved it, many people disapproved of this, saying this was ineffective, it was not safe, etc. But what the approval of Tacrin did do was to enhance the development and the approval of another generation of acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, which was safer. Now, some might say they're not terribly effective anyway, but they have helped, I think, a lot of patients. What about the analogy with TPA? Well, TPA, if you recall, there was only one major trial. This was the NIH. And again, people said, well, how on earth can you approve a drug with only one pivotal trial? This is wrong. But the FDA took the view that, look, there was a surrogate endpoint. It actually cleared the obstruction, the thrombus, and that there seemed to be a good clinical outcome. So they went for it. They also put in the proviso that there had to be, well, no, not the FDA, but the EMA said that to use it in Europe, you had to have a registry. And of course, we all know that this has led to huge improvements for stroke. Firstly, it made stroke treatable, and it meant that people would invest in stroke units. Bright young doctors would go to become stroke neurologists or or stroke physicians, because not only neurologists do this. And this has enabled us to go and sort of find better treatment. So, for, the advances about the thrombectomy And maybe the combination of thrombectomy and neuroprotectants would not have happened if TPA was not introduced. So I think that it's a very good point to make, that there are parallels. And sometimes you make a decision which is perhaps a little murky, but with the best of intentions.
Right. There's a question from Rohit Ramchandran about research on hyperbaric oxygen therapy to treat Alzheimer's disease in Israel. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not aware of this study. I'm sorry, and I'm just thinking about what the rationale would be. How would hyperbaric oxygen?
So
I guess
maybe I'll try and answer that, Chris. There's Bob Bellmaker, who was the president of INA before me, has actually conducted a study and published in MCI the use of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And interestingly, he got the idea from Korea, where you can sort of walk into an oxygen tent in a mall and be oxygenated for 20 minutes. So these preliminary studies have actually shown some good results. But obviously, I don't think it's at a point where we could recommend it as a treatment. It's still in a kind of a research stage. Other things that are in a research stage for MCI, other non-pharmacological treatments include the various neuromodulation treatments, TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, RTMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. All these are also non-pharmacological treatments in kind of research stage. So I think hyperbaric oxygen or even normobaric oxygen is part of that process.
If I could make a comment here.
Yes, Chris.
I think that one very important point that emerges from this particular success is how the FDA and other regulatory agencies will view treatment trials. So I think that treatment trials, which include people only on clinical grounds, may be less likely to get approval. And the drug agencies may want, for example, a clearer biological definition of who you're treating and what you're treating. So they want to see a surrogate endpoint, they want to see a target.
Right.
Yeah, so if you say, for example, hyperbaric oxygen works in patients with Alzheimer's disease, then the regulatory agency will want to know why and who. So are you treating people just with clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease? What's the severity? What is your target? And are you engaging with your target? If you just say that 20 minutes of oxygen makes you feel happier, your cognitive performance is better, I don't think they will approve it.
Right. So Sunil Shroff has a question about which biomarker tests one will have to do in order to be eligible for Aducanumab. I know you answered that differently, that they've not really specified it, but can I ask you what are the biomarker tests that one does in order to diagnose Alzheimer's disease? I think that's a better way of framing that question.
Okay, so there are a number of biomarkers you can use to get a more secure definition of Alzheimer's disease. The one that is most available to all of us would be structural brain scanning. So structural brain scanning would probably show you atrophy and would show you maybe hippocampal atrophy, and that would be what we call N, the neurodegenerative part of this ATM classification. But having neurodegeneration by itself is not specific for Alzheimer's disease. You can have neurodegeneration, all kinds of causes. So what is really needed is some kind of biomarker for amyloid. And the core biomarkers now are either CSF, where you find a low A-beta 42 level, or amyloid PET, where you see high amyloid PET burden. The emerging blood biomarkers may replace or may actually supplement these kind of core biomarkers, but to be absolutely sure now, you either need CSF, PET, both of whom are either invasive or expensive. What about T? So you can also do PET and CSF for tau, and you can also do blood biomarkers. I think the most interesting thing to emerge in the last couple of months, last year actually, has been the fact that phosphorylated tau in the blood seems to be an amazingly good biomarker both for amyloid and tau. I think that if I were to put my bets on what will happen in the future, I think a blood biomarker like p-tau 181 or 217 would be what we use to screen people.
And that brings us very neatly to the question, what's the tau story now that we've got a treatment that is focused on amyloid accumulation in the brain?
What's the tau story? So I'm going to jump now because I thought you were going to ask the next question. Okay, what are the effects of aducanumab on other biomarkers of AD? Well, there was a very limited tau PET study in the aducanumab trials. And what it suggested was a dramatic effect on tau, that patients on placebo had increase in tau, patients on low dose had a decrease, and patients on the high dose had an even greater increase. But you have to accept this PET story with a pinch of salt because you can see there are very, very few people. Nevertheless, there are also, hang on. Okay, there are also CSF studies. Again, not very many people, as you can see here, only 17 in the high dose group and 28 in the placebo group. But again, there is a reduction, a statistically significant reduction in tau. Is that what you want to hear?
Yes.
So very tantalizing, you know, and the amyloid treatment could prevent tau from accumulating or even eliminate tau. That was so startling.
And interestingly, for the amyloid tau battle, the blood biomarker could well be a tau biomarker that, as well for diagnosis, which yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's probably a false dichotomy. I don't think you have to believe in either amyloid or tau. I think we have to believe in both. That in Alzheimer's disease, amyloid and tau turn out to be inextricably linked.
I guess we were subjected to so many years of battles, listening to plenary speakers arguing with one another. So it takes a while to make the mental movement.
Yes.
Chris, the people have asked other questions about when this will come to India and so on, which I don't think we are equipped to answer because we don't really know. Any final thoughts? Anything else you'd like to tell us? Okay, I think that you had one last question about what will happen after this FDA approval has been given. Yes, absolutely. So they're going to roll out aducanumab in the USA. I read that up to 900 centers are already ready to give the drug, but you know what is unpredictable is what will patients think, how will the providers cope, and importantly, how will the insurers react? I think that you know America is a very rich country. You know, billions of dollars on the new drug will still have a huge impact. So I really look forward to seeing how my colleagues in the US cope with this. Regulatory approvals in other countries, I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't know what labeling restrictions will be imposed. Maybe different jurisdictions will ask for different things. And of course, there's this huge problem about reimbursement. I really don't know whether, okay. Firstly, I know that our healthcare systems are not prepared. And I know that we're going to have to work very hard to do something about it. And we have a few papers in preparation discussing what we should do in Asia. So please, hope to share these thoughts on what on actions in the near future. But I actually want to end up with how does this impact on future drug development? So some people say this is really terrible news. The availability of aducanumab will mean that all our patients will rush to taking aducanumab, so it will be impossible to do
clinical trials on other treatments anymore. Maybe in America, but not the rest of the world. And there are many other treatments which are in progress. So for example, Roche is doing trials on gantenerumab, and we're coming to the end of these trials. And again, it's also very promising that gantenerumab given in much higher doses than initially given does reduce amyloid, and there seems to be an effect on cognition. Similarly, Eisai is also doing a trial on a drug called BAN2401. I think they have a new name for it, Donanemab or something like that. And again, it reduces amyloid, and there seems, at least in the phase 2 studies, to be the same kind of decline. You can see here, the sum of boxes is 26%, right? Similar to Aducanumab. It looks much better on the ADAS-Cog. And I think importantly, there has been really promising work, again published by Lilly, on donanemab. So the phase 2 trial was positive. The phase 2 trial met its primary endpoint. It slowed decline on a composite scale by 32%, and they are recruiting now for another phase 2 study and a large phase 3 trial. So this was published in the New England Journal recently. You can all see it for yourselves, but here's the curves. It does show that donanemab has a disease-modifying effect. Again, it doesn't mean that you stop progressing, but you don't progress as fast, and that's terrific. It also has effects on biomarkers such as amyloid, and not much effect on tau, and not much effect on the hippocampus, but whole brain and ventricles, there seems to be an effect on empathy. Both drugs seem to be equivalent when you compare them side to side. Now, this is not the best way of comparing, but I think that both drugs will really need to do a lot better. I think that we may get there. So trials are ongoing, new treatments are coming up. I think this is a new era for Alzheimer's disease. And of course, there's not just antibodies, there are also other small molecules and other approaches to treating Alzheimer's disease.
And in a sense, therefore, this approval could have given us all stimulus to think differently about the treatment of Alzheimer's disease and our approach to the treatment of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, I would like to take that optimistic viewpoint. What's done is done. The FDA has approved it. So I think that rather than sort of, I think it's pretty honorable for the 3 advisory board members to resign, because I suppose if you're an advisory board and your advice is not taken, I mean, maybe the honorable thing to do is to resign. But then, of course, it's only an advisory board, and my advice is often not taken by my children, by my wife, by my patients. So I can't resign as a father and a husband, and a doctor. But,
or as a doctor, yeah.
Yeah, but good for them, okay? But I think that I would like to take the positive view that, look, this is a new step forward. Let's do our best to try and improve access to our patients. Let's try and change our mindset about the importance of dementia. And I think the very fact now that there is hope for treatment suddenly changes the game. People will not be nihilistic anymore. I hope we get more funding. I hope we have lots of bright young people who think that this is something exciting to do, will really be a tremendous and rich experience for them in their professional lifetime.
Chris, before we go, there's a very interesting question which just came up, which I thought I should ask you. Yes. How long do you think it might take to see clinical benefit? And is there any understanding of how much amyloid should be eliminated in order to see clinical benefit?
Okay. So I think the question of seeing clinical benefit is a very tough one, because as I pointed out, most patients are still declining, at least as measured by our CDR sum of boxes, etc. all I can say is that in the clinical trials that we're doing now, and I'm taking part in the Roche trial as well as the eyesight trial, there are patients who are stable. I mean, they're declining slightly, but they're not declining as fast as I would expect them to be. And, they are very, very happy to go on the open label part. And I think that that's probably how we sort of should measure clinical outcome, that people are stable, they have reasonably good quality of lives. We can also measure clinical outcomes in terms of biomarkers. And yes, I think that what I would like to see is elimination of amyloid, either by amyloid PET scan or by other biomarkers. Because I think that if you eliminate amyloid, you do not give the disease a chance to exert its worst effects. And I think that's one of the lessons we've learned from the earlier Alzheimer's trials, because everybody was very nervous in the past. Oh, we shouldn't reduce amyloid production that much. It could cause a lot of problems. It could cause RAE, RAH, et cetera, And I think that this reluctance to be intensive caused these trials to fail, or maybe one of the causes.
Right.
Come on, let's look at it from an oncological point of view. Are you satisfied that the tumor is still there? You want to eliminate it. Let's look at it from a cardiologist point of view. Are you happy that the occlusion is only 30% better? You want to get rid of it. So we're going towards being more surgical. Krish, if it's there, take it out.
I think it's so much to do with us neurologists, psychiatrists. We have a certain inbuilt obsessionality, isn't it? I
like to think of it this way, Krish, that we are used to treating people with long-term diseases, and we all realize that management is not just about a gung-ho approach. It's about ensuring that people's lives are as full of quality as possible. I mean, that is the virtue of a good neurologist or psychiatrist, that the pursuit of perfection is the enemy of the good. But I think in this instance, we have to learn from the trial experience and tell our patients or advise our patients who are fit and able and eligible for this kind of treatment. It's going to be tough, and there are going to be side effects. But if we push through it, you'll be better. I think that's how we're going to have to change. Same thing for multiple sclerosis, Krish.
Yeah. Yes. Many examples in medicine where people have taken leaps of faith. So I think there is a need for us to take a leap of faith here. And I think the FDA has approved that leap of faith. Thank you for a very clear and optimistic presentation, Chris. I think you've clarified a lot of doubts in people's minds. Some doubts will remain. And I think that is down to the fact that this is a very difficult space. But I will leave it with the words of Sir William Osler, that we cure sometimes, control often, and comfort always. And in dementia care, we're going from comfort to control, which perhaps is a very good step in progress. So from Buddhi Clinic and from all of us, Chris, thank you so much for taking time off on a Sunday morning.
Thank you very much for organizing
this. Very enlightening conversation.
It's a real pleasure. And thank you to all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us, all of you. Take care. Stay safe.
Thanks very much, Krish.
Muthu, stop the live streaming.